Question time reaction on BBC One.
We're in Salford tonight, where the leaders' debate took place this evening, and the question is, which of the Magnificent Seven came out well? Which of the Magnificent Seven came out on top, if any did? And what did we learn from it all? This is Question Time. And welcome to our viewers, our listeners, to our audience here, and, of course, to our panel. Tonight, the Conservative Chief Whip, Michael Gove, Labour's Shadow Health Secretary, Andy Burnham, the Liberal Democrat Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Danny Alexander, the columnist on The Independent, Yasmin Alibhai-Brown, and the Mail on Sunday columnist, Peter Hitchens. And if you haven't had enough of texting and tweeting already today, our hashtag, I remind you, is BBCQT. Follow us at BBC Question Time. Text comments to 83981. The red button will tell you what others are doing. Will Piers has our first question tonight. Mr. Piers.
Was tonight's debate a reflection of the chaotic and uncertain government we should expect after the general election? The
sight of all seven. And you're making the assumption, presumably, that nobody gets an overall majority.
Yes, exactly.
Michael Gove.
I think tonight's debate was a reflection of the chaotic and uncertain government we could have after the next election. Absolutely. I think that one person emerged as a very effective leader of the opposition, and that was Nicola Sturgeon, and one person emerged as someone who was truly prime ministerial, and that was David Cameron. And unfortunately, at the next election, there is only, to my mind, there is a clear choice, and unfortunately, if we have Ed Miliband as Prime Minister, the way in which he will be sustained in office is through votes from the Scottish National Party. Given the performance that Nicola Sturgeon gave tonight, it's clear that she and Alex Salmond would hold the whip hand in any Ed Miliband-led administration, and that would lead to more taxes, more borrowing, more welfare spending, and I think a recipe for chaos as the party that bankrupted Britain in the past and the party that wants to break up Britain in the future try to cobble together some sort of Frankenstein government for the next 5 years.
A lot of people seem to rather admire Nicola Sturgeon.
Yes, well... absolutely. People do admire Nicola Sturgeon because she's a very effective operator. But what I fear is that if we have Nicola and Alex Salmond determining what happens, then we will have the government of the United Kingdom shaped in the interests of only one part of the kingdom rather than all of us. And I think that would be a mistake.
OK, Andy, I'll come to you in a moment. The man at the very back there, what do you think?
Do you realistically believe that you can actually win the general election when you failed to win it in 2010 as well?
Yes, I absolutely do. We only need to win in 23 seats in order to get a majority. We only need 11,000 more votes in those seats. And it's already the case. I think opinion polls in tomorrow's newspapers show that we're at 37%, which is a higher share of the vote than we had last time round.
Come on, the polls. They're going on.
David, I thought
it's like going...
Is that a sort of symbology?
Yes.
To expect from the BBC? How much are you paid for high-level political commentary like that?
Well, that's about what it is, isn't it? It's like going to the fairground.
What we heard from David Cameron this evening, so it's a good commentary.
you, man.
I want to ask, as a Scot living in England, why Michael Gove makes a statement like that.
Yes,
it's being a bit abusive to the Scots. We have a right to have MPs in Westminster as well to actually put our views forward. But we don't. We're not looking at it as from an independence point of view. We don't want austerity, and we're trying to say to other people in England, hopefully you are feeling the same. We want rid of this government.
Were you voting in Scotland? Will you vote in Scotland?
No, I live and work here. I will be voting here.
OK, Andy Burnham, do you want to answer that? Because you've heard what Michael Gove says about how Labour would be supported by the Scots or run by the SNP.
Well, I mean, the Tories are running this line. There's just no evidence for it at all. I mean, to answer the main question, I think, no, it won't reflect it, because the momentum now is with Ed Miliband and Labour in this campaign. I think he came out in the polls as the winner in this debate tonight. And why? Because I think he talked to the country. People can see now that this caricature that the right-wing media have been building for years now isn't actually what Ed Miliband is. He's a man full of warmth and conviction who is in touch with people.
What's the picture they've been building?
That he's, some kind of, he's a geek and this and that, and all, they can't eat a bacon sandwich and all the rest of it. What you saw tonight is Ed Miliband holding the centre ground. That was what I saw tonight. We had the Greens, Plaid and SNP not credible on the deficit. They're almost kind of denying it needed to be dealt with. On the other side, we had the Prime Minister isolated and extreme on cuts. He was the only person saying that we want very deep cuts. And Mr Farage was extreme on a lot of things. So Ed Miliband holding the centre ground, and that is where elections are won from. So I think tonight the momentum is with Labour in this campaign. Ed has been underestimated. He's beginning to come over to the British people, and it's been a very good night for Labour.
OK. The woman there in the second row.
But the fact of the matter is that these debates seem to be won on personality and not on policy. Quite a lot of the time, particularly Nick Clegg last year, in the last election, he played the part of a person who was outside of that, who was playing amongst these two leaders who were just fighting with each other. And same with Nigel tonight. Nigel was coming across as if he was a person who was a joke and a bit of a laugh and someone of a working person rather than someone who actually is serious about policy.
But did it reveal anything to you, that all 7 being there together?
It revealed that it was just chaos. For me personally, I found no sense in it whatsoever.
All right,
in the fact that people were just arguing constantly.
I'll, like they do on Question Time, I'll come to you in a minute. I'll go to you, sir, on the corner first. Yes.
Me?
Yep, you. No, the man in front of you.
Hello. I'd just like to say that I just think that Labour and the other parties on the left are talking about wanting to reduce the cuts that are being taken. Whilst I have some sympathy with that, I just think that it's our generation who are going to be paying the debts for that, and I'd just like to see a bit more responsibility with your approach.
On the debt. Okay. And you, sir? In the third row. The man in the third row there.
Andy, you were talking about Ed Miliband talking to the country tonight. I'll tell you what we saw tonight. We saw a great picture of politics in this country. We saw a lot of over-preparation and people talking too much. At the end of the day, most of them looked absolutely fake. The only one who looked like he was actually having a proper conversation with people on the other side of the screen, for all, whether we disagree with his policy or not, was Nigel Farage. He's the only one who looked like he was actually having a proper chat with you. Okay. And that's the problem with politicians in this country, is that you remove yourselves too far from the ordinary man. I don't think most of you are weird, as a lot of people do, but you make yourselves weird by simply just not being real. And I don't know whether that's fear of being too real and exposing too much, or whether it's you feel like we want to see this fake sort of, a demeanour. At the end of the day, talk to us like we're real people, because you're real, we're all in this country, apparently together.
Well, I think there's no question you're right about that, because Mr Farage began by saying quite correctly that it was 6 against 1. 6 establishment parties, 6 pro-European Union parties, 6 pro-mass immigration parties, 6 parties completely steeped in the liberal Blairism, which infects them all. And he was the one alternative. I mean, many of us have criticisms of Mr Farage, but he did actually put across a point of view which is simply not represented properly in Parliament. And I think that went across.
Point of view across differently. It was like he looked real. Now, I'm not saying I agree with him or disagree with him, but he just looked real.
Well, I think the two things are connected. The others had all been sent there. They'd been trained extensively by spin doctors, rehearsed incessantly, so that they would not commit any news. The whole idea of their being there was not to make any mistakes, to expose themselves to any further danger. Farage wasn't worried about that. He actually wanted to be news because he wants people to know that he exists. And I think that was his major success. And I think that was the most important element of the debate.
Danny Alexander, did you recognise this picture of people being over-prepared? We know they were all here, being groomed for the role they'd play, trying it out with other members of their parties, testing expressions.
Yeah, to some extent.
Is that gentleman right to say you've just distanced yourself?
To some extent, I do recognise the point that the gentleman is making, and in a sense, this is the only of these debates that's taking place in this election, which is a shame, because David Cameron didn't want to take part in it anymore. There's only going to be one. And so,
what's that all about?
And so, therefore, the people taking part have a limited opportunity, which they want to take, to try and get their message across. And that's what they've been trying to work out how to do. But I think the gentleman makes a fair point, which is that sometimes, therefore, people come across not perhaps as themselves, which is, I think, what you're saying. I thought, actually, Nick Clegg gave a very gutsy performance. He talked about, another gentleman there was talking about responsibility, the need to take responsibility on the nation's finances, whilst also being fair about it. And I think that, in a sense, in this election, it's pretty clear to most people that no party is going to win an overall majority. And so the question a lot of people are asking, watching this debate, is who do we want exercising influence over the next government? And I think when you look at what Nick was saying about how we can be responsible, how we can have a strong economy and a fair society, actually the message there is that you need to have Liberal Democrats in the mix to stop Labour pulling our country to the left, to stop the Tories pulling it to the right. And
yeah, but it's no good. It's no good saying all these things if you look like a bunch of phonies, as he says, and not like real people.
Well, I just addressed...
How do you compete with Nigel Farage?
I just addressed that point. But one of the things I was going to say to Michael was, I mean, Michael's a Scot, I'm a Scot, I represent a constituency in Scotland, as that lady was saying, albeit I'm not a Scottish nationalist, as she sounds like she might be, which is fair enough. We can disagree on that.
You don't represent a constituency at the moment, because you're not an MP.
I have for the last 10 years, and I hope to continue doing so in the Highlands after this election. But I think the way the Conservative Party are going about explicitly talking up the SNP in this election is utterly disgraceful. I think, Michael, you should be ashamed of yourself. The Nationalists want to break up this country. We spent time winning a referendum just a few months back, and now your election tactic is to talk up the SNP incessantly.
There's a very simple
and I think
reason
it's utterly
for that.
disgraceful.
Can I explain why they do that? What the Conservative Party really want, the only way they can ever get a majority at Westminster again, is if Scotland leaves the United Kingdom. They can't say it, but it's what they think. And that is why they behave as they have. Accidentally on purpose, the Conservative-led government has given the SNP the biggest boost in the past 5 years that it's had in its entire history.
Hold on. Let Michael Gove have a go, and I'll come to you, Eleanor. Yeah, go on.
No, I'm deeply concerned about the prospect of the United Kingdom breaking up. That's why I
Why are you fueling it, then?
I'm not. You are, Andy. Because your party is not in a position to win the next general election.
Why?
You're the party that's losing seats to the SNP and losing the argument against the SNP in Scotland. Nicola Sturgeon's performance tonight was widely rated, including by people in this audience, as impressive. One of the reasons why it was impressive is because the argument for the United Kingdom has not been made effectively by politicians north of the border, Labour or Liberal Democrat. That's why we find ourselves in this position. But we do have a chance to have a majority government, as I pointed out when the gentleman at the back questioned me about it. There are only 23 seats that the Conservatives need to win in order to secure a majority across the United Kingdom.
As the only woman on the panel,
I'd be delighted, Jasmine.
Thank you. Stop. First of all, I thought the women did fantastically well. Absolutely wonderful. And I so agree with what the lady said. I'm quite shocked, actually. Here they were rushing up during the referendum, during the Scottish referendum, duplicitous to a man, trying to say, we're in it together, we love you, Scotland. And here comes the SNP with a fantastic leader whose progressive policies are at odds with, actually, it seems to me, all the parties. And she speaks for quite a number of us who don't have the vote. But actually, the policy she described on Europe, on austerity, I wish she was Prime Minister, but I think it's completely unacceptable to treat the SNP and Alex Salmond as if he's Guy Fawkes and we want to burn him for whatever reason. This is the United Kingdom. Respects them. Respect the Scots. They're part of us.
But Yasmin, there is an internal contradiction in your position. You respect and you admire Nicola Sturgeon, but she wants to break up the United Kingdom, which you and I recognise is a success story over the last 300 years that we want to keep going.
So why are you talking them up then, Michael? I mean, that's why I'm not...
Right, let's get...
And let me just say as well...
I'm pointing out the threat and the danger of having the SNP in power. We've ruled out any cooperation with the SNP. You haven't.
Very smug and... You're sounding very smug and complacent, Michael, when talking about Labour's prospects in this election.
If
they're so poor, why did you refuse to debate Ed Miliband? Did Mr Cameron refuse to debate it? You're running away.
Hang on. Can you pin down, Andy, because you've made the assertion without pinning down your reasons, why you say the Tories are supporting the SNP, and you said the same, that the Tories are backing the SNP. In what way?
Because you've heard it from Michael tonight, talking up the prospects of the SNP, saying that Labour can't win. Well, I'm afraid that is a very complacent view to take.
That's not talking up the SNP, just say Labour can't win.
Yes, it is. I mean, Michael said it a few times that we would have to be...
How many opinion polls, Andy, show you winning a majority of seats in Scotland?
Well, he's a Scottish MP.
How many opinion polls, Danny, show you holding seats in Scotland?
Danny, what is it you complain about?
The truth is that Labour and the Liberal Democrats have said, don't worry, to the Conservatives and others, we know how to deal with the SNP. They have comprehensively failed to do so. That is why our United Kingdom is under threat. We've made it perfectly clear we're not going to do deals with the SNP. We're not going to break up our kingdom. Andy hasn't denied
they're not going to
they've
deal with you. It's
I have
easy
to say,
for you.
Michael, that is...
the SNP have said they won't touch you with a barge pole.
The feeling is mutual.
There you are. There's no great decision from your part. What is it you're saying?
I mean, I don't...
What's the allegation?
I don't think you should put the SNP in charge of the United Kingdom any more than you put UKIP in charge of the European Union. It just doesn't stack up. But I think that the way that the Conservative Party are going out, putting out posters of Alex Salmond, buying him publicity that money couldn't buy himself, saying that people in Scotland should vote for the SNP, and that the reason they're saying it is because
we're not,
there's an unholy...
We are arguing against the SNP, something that you've failed to do successfully.
There is an unholy alliance, I think, going on between the Conservatives and the SNP, abetted by Labour's failure to take this issue seriously in terms of nationalism in Scotland, which is that they both want to talk each other up in order to support each other's electoral prospects. And I think it's pretty bad for this country that it's got to this stage. And to Yasmin's point about the SNP being a progressive party, when I look at my own constituency in the Highlands, what's happening in the NHS, what's happening in terms of infrastructure investment.
They do not malign.
I don't want to leave Europe.
They do not malign.
I look at what's happening with the police, the centralisation of the police service in Scotland. It's absolutely appalling.
Hang on. I heard Nicola Sturgeon and the other women actually not falling for UKIP's populism, actually saying something decent about immigrants, actually not humiliating us.
Well, I heard Nick Clegg doing the same and challenging Nigel Farage on his appalling conduct.
The Scots do not want to leave Europe.
All right, Yasmin.
The Scots don't want to leave Europe.
Peter, and then I'm going to... Hold on, Peter, you speak next, and then I'm going to come back to you in the audience, because a lot of hands up, and I want to hear your views about this, not just the panels.
A simple test question for Michael Gove. In a seat in Scotland, which is marginal, between Labour and the SNP, who do you really hope will win?
I certainly don't want the SNP to win any seats. I would rather have...
You would rather Labour won
Let me answer the question. It's a tough question.
One or the other.
No. First of all, Peter, I would always urge people to vote Conservative in any seat. But I would rather our United Kingdom was preserved. And so for that reason, one of the reasons why I stood with the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats in the campaign, better together, was because I believe that our United Kingdom is more important than any individual political party.
So, from the point of... Hold on.
Wasn't in any way an answer to the question.
From the point of view of the United Kingdom, you would therefore prefer, if there weren't an overall Tory majority, an overall Labour majority, so they could rule without having to deal in any way with the SNP.
I do not want the
That's
SNP.
what he's saying. Yeah.
Well, the
this
Labour
is almost like hatred, Michael. It's a legitimate party. Its popularity is going up, unlike every other party. Is it jealousy? What is it?
OK, let's go to
No, it's a fundamental
audience.
disagreement, yes.
All right, we'll go to members of our audience. A woman in the middle there, at the, a bit to the... Yes, you at the back. Second row from the back, yes.
Personally, I think it's a far more dangerous prospect for the Tories to be doing a deal with the UKIP than it is for Labour to be doing a deal with the SNP.
And you think they might?
I think they might. To get a majority government.
Have the Tories ruled out doing any kind of arrangement with UKIP?
We've absolutely no interest in being anything other than a majority Conservative government.
Yeah, that's not the answer to the question.
I'm not interested in doing a deal with anyone.
Has it been ruled out officially? That's what he asked.
I don't believe that we've said that we wouldn't consider, for example, talking to, in the event of having a minority, other parties to support us, but we're not interested.
No, he's asked the pertinent question.
Yes.
Have you publicly ruled out any deal with UKIP? The 2 or 3 or 4 UKIP members...
We're listening, Michael.
That Peter Hitchens question was hard, but that's an easy one. You can answer that one.
You've got to be interested, because he's asking you the question. You can't say you're not interested.
Michael,
we need to know.
I think you can take from that they are thinking about doing a deal with UKIP. That's the clear... That is what's happening.
Given that you are, as we know, an enthusiastic Blairite, would you rather a deal with Labour, a grand coalition of the German type, rather than have a government dominated by the SNP?
I don't want to have any grand coalition or any coalition of any kind. I want a majority Conservative
government. I know you don't want one, but would you do one?
And that's what I'm concentrating on doing. And I think, in a way, one of the points that's been made by the speculation about post-election coalitions is that a majority government of whatever kind would provide a greater degree of stability than coalitions would, particularly the chaotic coalition that seems most likely if the SNP do well, which is the prospect of the SNP trying to prop up Ed Miliband and Ed
You're
Miliband
the one doing the speculation about the
So what
deal
I would rather do,
Michael,
what I would rather do is make the
this.
argument for a Conservative government implementing the policies which over the last 5 years have seen us move forward from the economic mess that we inherited to economic
you're
success.
The one who entered, you're the one who brought post-election deals into this debate tonight. And that says to me, it's clear that you don't believe anymore you can win an outright majority. And that is why you're running these scare stories tonight. And it's absolutely clear.
So the man up there, the second row from the back, with the beard. There, you, sir. Yes.
Hello there. I really would like to hear from the panel a reason why people don't seem to be, the parties, in particular geographical areas, they just don't seem to be unified anymore. Andy, you're my local MP. We've sat around a table ourselves. Why is it that there seems to be a drive towards breaking away, even in the local area? Yeah. Lee wants to break up with Wigan. The South wants to break up with Greater Manchester in devolution. Scotland wants to separate from the UK. It's chaos. Why is it happening?
All right, let me put... I'm not going to put it straight to him. I'll put it to Danny Alexander.
I think it's a very good question, and in a sense, perhaps it's coming from the fact that we've been going through very difficult economic times, and people want to look to their own area to try and say, well, maybe that sense of identity is going to be more important to us than the things that can really help get our economy going. I think, though, there is a very powerful case for more devolution, for more local control. I think that the work, for example, that we've been doing in Greater Manchester to say this area itself can take more control over its own affairs in terms of the health service, in terms of training and skills and infrastructure. I think more politics needs to be closer to home like that. But I also think that there are decisions that are better made at a UK level. I think there are decisions that are better made at a European level too. And I think that the right way to conduct politics is to have the right decisions made at the right level of government. And I think that England has been very centralised. Scotland is now one of the most centralised places in the whole of Europe under the SNP government. I think decentralisation, devolution of power, that's part of having a fairer society by giving people more control over what happens in their own areas.
Andy, briefly.
I think you do make a very profound point, and I think it's happening all over Europe. In difficult times, people start to look a bit more inward, become a bit more insular, and I think that's happening, as you rightly say, at an international, national and a more local level as well. And this is what I worry about nationalism in any form. Yeah. They used to be the tartan Tories, didn't they, the SNP, and now they're leaning left. Because nationalism will dress itself up in any clothes that's fashionable to further the cause of nationalism. But I just don't believe in politics based on borders on the ground that says that we're different from them and therefore we'll define ourselves against them and separate ourselves from them. Politics has got to be about people, collective interests, working together across borders. And that's why I think what's happening is really divisive. Once you've got this negative energy and negative momentum in politics, it just starts polarising everybody and everything starts breaking up. And that's what's beginning to happen here. And that's what Michael has done tonight is quite irresponsible because it kind of fuels that. You're making a brilliant point. And all my politics is about fighting against that. Collectivism, working together, internationalism. That's got to be a better future for us locally and this country as a whole. Okay.
Who wants to come in on this? And let me bring the man in orange shirt there. That's a political statement or not?
He wasn't elected as Prime Minister last time, but tonight he spoke about getting a majority. What does David Cameron think has changed since the last election that somehow he's going to get the mandate of the people?
All right. Well, I think the thing that's changed is that we inherited a country which was, compared to Greece economically, and now, after 5 years, we've created...
Hardly ever Greece.
Well,
excuse me.
That was at the time, the markets were genuinely worried because the scale of the deficit, the problems that we had economically, meant those comparisons were being made. Now, after 5 years, we've created, thanks to the hard work of the British people, 1.9 million new jobs, 1,000 jobs created every day.
We were never in the economic depths that Greece is in today. I'm
sorry,
that's a completely fallacious comparison.
We were certainly facing big economic difficulties, and it's certainly the case.
Can we stop this record ever? It's not true. This country is £1.5 trillion in debt.
Yes.
Which it wasn't when you took over. There has been no increase in productivity. There has been no increase substantially in exports. There has been instead an enormous increase in immigration, a vast number of low-wage jobs. All they've done is they've created a low-wage economy and a lot of statistics and a lot of borrowed money. And to proclaim this as an economic triumph is particularly irresponsible because when the election's over, they'll be back to you again saying, hey, look, things are really terrible and we're going to have to introduce all kinds of tax rises and spending cuts we never mentioned before. Now they're saying it's a triumph. In 6 months' time, they'll be admitting what it really is.
Yes.
1.5 trillion national debt is incredible. I wish they'd stop saying it. This isn't true.
I want to go back to the other comment about the fragmentation, because I think it's such a central question. I think what we've seen in the last 5 years is a deliberate... any nation needs a sense of the greater good that we used to have. And in the last 5, 6 years, the poor have been turned against the poor. Those on benefits hate other people on benefits. Everybody hates migrants. And it's created a really uneasy society. And it hasn't made any of us happier, I think.
OK. The woman there, 1, 2, third row. Just you, yes.
Why do the statistics change depending on who's talking about it?
She said, why do the statistics change?
Why did the statistics change?
Yeah.
I suspect it's because there are an awful lot of statistics out there. But, I mean, can I just address this point that
very briefly, if you would, 'cause I'd like to go on to another question. Yes.
Of course, Britain isn't Greece, but it's also true that we faced an incredibly difficult economic situation back in 2010. We had been through one of the most serious economic crises of modern times. We had a deficit the largest in Europe, and it required a strong and stable government to put in place a balanced plan to deal with it. But it wasn't a Conservative plan, or indeed a wholly Liberal Democrat plan. It was a coalition effort. And I think that it is also right in this conversation that we're having, in an election where it's clear that no one party is going to have an overall majority, that we also recognise that strong and stable governments put together by parties that have a sense of responsibility for the long-term future of the country can work. That's why, by the way, I don't think that the SNP or UKIP would work in that sense. But I also think that we, as politicians, have a responsibility to conduct ourselves in a way that means that we can govern this country effectively, strongly and fairly after the election, whatever the result that the British people throw up.
You never listened to anything Peter said.
No, I
did, actually. I listened very carefully.
Could I answer your question?
Answered.
It's very... David Cameron actually doesn't know the difference between the deficit and the national debt. And in a speech actually confused them.
No,
the deficit is the shortfall between spending and income each year. And that the government said it would get rid of, and it hasn't. The national debt is what we owe cumulatively, year upon year upon year. That has grown immensely, exponentially under this government. They're two different things.
It will grow, of course, if the deficit is still there. You, sir.
Will the Labour Party provide us with a cast-iron guarantee that in the likely event of a hung parliament, they will not form any coalition with the SNP?
Why?
Yes.
They have done that. It's slightly less clear whether they would talk to the SNP or
any
come to
formal
some
agreement
kind of
or any
arrangement.
coalition with
or
the
even
SNP.
an informal
We've
agreement.
got friends.
We've ruled it out.
Who's going to befriend Tory? No one would touch the Tories with the barge pole.
Sorry, but Andy,
I think we've just been in coalition for the last 5 years with the Liberal Democrats.
So you're completely ruling out any coalition?
Any arrangement?
Absolutely.
Sorry, let's get clear.
So Ed Miliband... Sorry, David, over to you.
Thank you very much. What are you ruling out?
We're ruling out... you asked about a coalition, we're ruling that out. I don't want to see any form of arrangement deal with the SNP because, this is probably where I agree with Michael. Anything that furthers the cause of the breakup of the UK is not something that I want to put my name to.
So you'll ignore the SNP? You would never ask them to come into the lobby with you? Yes, madam. What do you think?
But David, Andy hasn't answered the question there, which is,
Mr. Burnham,
would you accept SNP support for a Labour government?
Will you rule out any coalition?
Realistically, going to get into bed with, who are the odd bedfellows with Labour in a coalition government?
We're fighting for a majority Labour government, and honestly, I think it's people laugh, but it's how can I tonight start speculating and second guessing what the public are doing because of the polls? The polls have been wrong.
So who is Labour going to go into coalition with?
Wait a second, Michael. The polls.
You didn't. You
The
didn't
polls
rule
have
out
been wrong
UKIP.
many times before. I did rule it out if you listen to what I said.
So, Mr.
I am
Burnham, you're
fighting for a
providing us with a cast
majority
iron
Labour
guarantee.
government.
You're providing us with a cast iron guarantee that you will not form any coalition or any
did say
formal
that to
agreement
you.
if you
I
need
did say that to you.
form a coalition.
No coalition. I said that,
Mate,
but
you will
would
not
you
form
accept
any
that?
coalition.
I said directly no
That's a
coalition.
Yeah,
cast
so
iron
look,
guarantee. for the
we've
Labour
dealt
Party.
with no coalition. I think that's clear, and I think Ed Miliband has made that clear. No coalition, no SNP,
No formal agreement as well.
SNP
I said, yeah.
ministers,
I
he
said,
said,
yeah.
in a Labour government. But that isn't the question that he's asking. He's asking whether you make any kind of agreement, accommodation with the SNP, or whether you treat
no
them...
formal agreement. I said I didn't want to see
So
any
an informal
kind of deal. You asked me a question. I answered your question
Okay, right. I think we're going to stop
very
this 'cause
directly.
On my
it's an
right,
informal
wait a minute. On my right, we've had a refusal to absolute refusal to rule out any
I said I
deal
didn't
with the
want
UK.
to see any kind of
And on
deal.
my-
How much clearer
and
do you
on
want
my-
me to be?
No,
If you
you're about as
they
clear
won't
as...
prop up any form of
I said any
Labour
kind of
government.
deal.
Okay.
I couldn't be.
I think
So isn't it the
viewers
case
can make
that
up their
the
mind
leaders' debates tonight
what people
have
on
actually
either
been-
side of me said
Isn't
about
it a case
deals.
that tonight the leaders' debates have actually been about the complexion of the next government based on style rather than substance?
Yasmin.
I don't know what you mean by that, because I thought there was quite a lot of substance,
But it
actually.
did come across that the leaders
but,
were rather looking at out-soundbiting each other against the clock.
I don't think it was, actually. I was surprised that it wasn't. I thought, actually, I really did see real thinking, real differences in real politics coming through, which I had very low expectations. Maybe that's why I'm surprised.
All right.
But what I think we will have to get used, maybe, in this country, to more of a PR kind of parliament, maybe more Borgen than the way we've
More
been.
Borgen than House of Cards.
Yes, and that would be a very good thing in my
All right, well,
opinion.
Could I suggest another solution? The reason why our perfectly good system is in such trouble is because it's dominated by two dead parties, kept alive by dodgy millionaires and government handouts, and by the broadcasting rules which allow them far more time than they really deserve. If one of those parties collapse, they are, as I've said before, they're two corpses with rigor mortis. If one falls, the other one will fall. The Labour Party is only held together by its hatred of the Tories. The Tory Party is only held together by other people's money. There is nothing else that keeps these parties in being. They don't actually represent anybody very much.
Hold on.
It's time we got rid of them and replaced them with more representative parties.
Okay, right. And on that point, I just want to take a quick question from Richard Coulby, please, and I want a yes or no answer from the panel to it. Richard Coulby.
Will this election be the end of the first past-the-post system?
Yes.
Yes.
You think it will? The end of it? It'll change?
It's the beginning of a big change, yes. And a good thing, too.
Michael Gove?
No.
Right. Andy Burnham?
No.
Peter Hitchens?
I very much fear so. I hope not, but I fear so.
You like first past the post?
I love first past the post. It means you can make a dud Prime Minister leave Downing Street with his removal van the day after an election. It's a wonderful thing. Almost no other country has it. And we should keep it. It's a marvellous way of showing politicians what we think of them and keeping them under control.
I hope so, but probably not, because you hear again from the Labour and Tory parties how they love the current voting system. And one of the reasons I found the current coalition so disruptive is because it gets in the way of that pendulum swinging between a red government and a blue government and back again.
I'm sure the public expressed a view on this, didn't they, after the last election? And don't they like the clarity that the system brings, the constituency link about
that? We had a referendum on the alternative vote, which, as I recall at the last election, was your party's policy. You advocated that change. Right. You didn't really argue for it in the referendum, so I think it's a bit rich coming from you.
We're going to go to another question now. By the way, we're going to be in Bristol next week. And we're going to be in East London the week after that, so the details of how to join Question Time are there on the screen. Jackie Lord, let's hear a question from you, please.
Yes. With public services stretched to the max, do we now say that the country is full?
Do we now say the country is full? Peter Hitchens.
Well, yes, it is. And I think the country simply wasn't designed for the level of population that it has, in terms of housing, in terms of transport, in terms of education, in terms of health provision. We simply haven't got enough. And both the major parties, all three major parties, have got together in this belief that large-scale immigration is part of the solution of the economic problems they've created. What they've never understood is that actually you can't impose on people this level of mass immigration, not just because of the physical problems, which are great, Because if your children are at a school which is affected by it, or if your local health service is affected by it, it is a serious problem. And one word, by the way, to Yasmin, who keeps going on about how people are against migrants. Nobody who's seriously against immigration has any animus against migrants whatsoever. I admire these people. I've lived abroad a couple of times in my life under wonderful conditions with a great deal of help. Anybody who can uproot himself and come to another country has my complete admiration. They do what they do because they think it's sensible and because they're brave and enterprising. Nothing against them. But we as a country encourage them, the politicians encourage them to come, create the conditions in which they come, and they are the ones who need to be challenged. Yes, we are full. It's plain that we're full. And not merely is it doing great harm to our social services and to our health service and to our education and our transport and our housing, it's also doing great social harm because you simply can't, in a civilised fashion, absorb this number of people at once. People need time to integrate and to become British. They can't do it at this rate. It's never been attempted before. An experiment on this scale has never been attempted before in this country, and it doesn't seem to me to be working.
And so you must leave the EU, in effect, to stop free movement of people.
For any measure of self-government, we would have to leave the European Union because these decisions are not taken by us. And if you want decisions about the governing of your country to be taken elsewhere, then these are the people to come to. Right. They can arrange it for you. They will collect the salaries and they'll sit in the ministerial offices and they'll pose with the red boxes and they'll pass the decisions upwards to Brussels and Frankfurt and Luxembourg, where these things are actually done. But if you actually want it done yourself, you have to say, actually, oddly enough, most countries in the world, given the chance to become independent, including most of our former empire, we say, wonderful, you're independent, great, raise your flag, control your own affairs. We ourselves run away from independence. We seem to think that we're unable to cope with it. And why is that?
Michael Gove, you said that in the present circumstances, given a vote today, you'd vote to leave the EU. Peter Hitchens said you're using immigration to keep a low-wage economy and keep the economy growing at the pace it's growing at. What do you say to that?
In direct answer to the lady's question, is Britain full? No, it is not full. I think that I think it's important to stress, yes, that migration levels have been too high in the past. We need to bring them down, but it is a good thing when talented people who want a better life and who can contribute to this country come here, in our public services, in our NHS. The nurses and doctors who care for us, in many cases, come from outside the United Kingdom and outside the European Union. There are gifted teachers in state schools who've come from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and who are contributing to making sure that our children grow up with wider horizons. I think it's critically important to make sure that we have a balanced approach towards immigration, because our country has succeeded in the past by being open, by being inclusive, by being a united kingdom. And I think that the debate on immigration has been poisoned by those who say that we should pull up the barriers, and it's also been damaged by those who say we should have an open door. We need a balanced approach which works in Britain's interests and shows us to be the generous and open nation that I've always believed us to be.
But Michael, why aren't we, you say we should bring people in from abroad to do these things, why aren't we training our own teachers and our own nurses? And why is it morally acceptable to plunder poor countries of their trained people, who they've spent a fortune on training to bring them here? And also, how is it that in all this growth of employment there is still almost 1 million, as you should know, having been an education secretary, almost 1 million people, young people, not in education, employment or training?
Jackie Lloyd, what do you think?
Why is that so?
What do you think, Jackie?
Yes, I think we are stretched, and it does feel full. We haven't enough schools, all the services are struggling, and perhaps we should address these issues before we carry on as we are.
Yasmin, what would you say to that?
Well, I never thought I would so agree with Michael Gove that I would want to hug him, which has never happened before. But he's absolutely right. We have to also think of the other side. We would not have the care sector, which is one of the most important sectors at the moment as our people get older, without migrant labour. There are so many sectors, the National Health Service, education, and you know, sometimes this is not a new story. I came in 1972, the same conversations and headlines. You ask Jewish people who came in the 40s and 50s, it never stops. And, you know, I think it is time to look at and say thank you. The Office of Budget Responsibility 10 days ago said we would not have come out of the recession without migrant workers. I wish today Ed Miliband had had the courage to say that, you know, to share that fact. I really wish he had.
The woman there.
What frustrates me about the debate about migration is we're forgetting Britain's history, colonial past. You know, like, we plundered countries. Our country is built on our bloody, bloody history. We've got a lot of blood on our hands. So it's like, how are we forgetting that? How are we forgetting that when we're talking about people coming to this country and having a closed door? It's disgusting.
You would like a completely open door?
I am no borders, absolutely.
No borders?
Yeah.
Andy Burnham, are you no borders?
No, although I do think you make a very good and fair point, which is take a longer view, because I take a longer view because of my own family experience. I remember my dad worked abroad in the 1980s when there was no work here. That was the RV design era. And, you know, we can't just say it's full now. We've got to take a kind of view over that period of time. In the past, people here had to go abroad and look for work. And if that was all right for us then, you can't just say it's not all right for people now. So I like Yasmin, I do agree with Michael. I thought he spoke very well just now. If we had a UKIP-style immigration policy, take it from me, our NHS just wouldn't be able to function. Waiting lists would be so high, and, you know, we've relied on doctors from around the world. They've built the National Health Service through its 67-year history. But where Peter makes a fair point is on really making sure we're bringing through the next generation, because I think that's not what we're doing at the moment. We're not giving hope to our own young people. So we've got a commitment to 20,000 nurses that Ed Miliband talked about tonight. I want all of those nurses to be homegrown, brought through from young people working today in the care sector, where they're on a 0 hours contract, getting less than the minimum wage because they're not paid for the travel time between their 15-minute visits. Let's give hope to our own young people. This government has cut nurse training places, and that is wrong, because the bill for agency nurses is going through the roof in the NHS.
Let's talk about the NHS. We're talking
Let's
about
get these things into balance. One last point, if I may, Dave. One last point.
Yeah,
I could not defend at the 2010.
Would you?
I could not defend at the 2010 general election in Lee that notion of sending benefits back to all parts of Europe. And I believe it is right that we've changed the debate in this country now. I think we're saying yes to free movement, not to free movement of benefits. That's something I think is common ground.
On the stairs there. Yes.
Why were there no questions during the debates regarding ISIS and the foreign situation? Are we to assume that all the parties are isolationists?
The answer would be, I think, that they limited the questions to 4. They didn't talk about Britain's place in the world exactly, did they, or foreign policy? Did you miss that in those debates?
I think there.
Say again.
We talked about the EU. How is that not foreign policy?
Yeah,
it was dominated by the EU.
There was a debate about the EU and there was a debate about immigration. They can't cover every topic in those debates. But my answer to Jackie's question is I think that Britain is at its best when we are an open-minded, open-hearted, tolerant nation that welcomes people who come here with skills to bring in our workforces, as Michael and Andy have both said and Yasmin has said, in our health service, in our education system. In many parts of our economy, we rely on workers from other parts of the world. And I think the idea that we should somehow become a sort of shrivelled, inward-looking country that pulls up the drawbridge and says we're not going to welcome people to this country, that would be a betrayal of hundreds and hundreds of years of British history. We should be leading in the European Union, not talking about leaving the European Union. And the real answer to your question about the public services is to make sure that we invest in the health service and the education system so that we do have the public services to meet the needs of all the people who are living here. In tonight's debate, Nick Clegg was the only leader to commit to providing the £8 billion over the next 5 years that the NHS needs, according to Simon Stevens. That's the right approach, not pulling up the drawbridge, not becoming the kind of nasty country that Nigel Farage was recommending to us this evening.
I just want to go back to what you said. I was surprised too. And I do have to say that one thing that is affecting the immigration debate is this fear, and a completely justifiable fear, of young people who were born here, you know, whose parents came from elsewhere for a better future, who are beginning to be so enticed by the worst kind of Islam. And I speak as a Muslim woman, and I would have thought that would have been a burning question, but it wasn't. And from that point of view, I can see why some people are worried about what's happened to society. I do understand that. actually.
OK. Should we just briefly deal with that? How much longer have we got? We've got a quarter of an hour. Let's just take an ISIS question, but then I want to go to the NHS, because we have more questions about the NHS than anything else. Aaron Hepworth.
Why do British Muslims leave the relative peace of the UK to go and live under Islamic State?
And we saw today a family coming back from crossing or trying to cross the border into Syria. Can we be quite brief on this? I know it's a complicated question, but can we be quite brief on it? Because I'd like to get the NHS in as well. The question is, why leave the relative peace of the UK? Yasmin, you were halfway into it.
I was halfway into it. I wish I knew. It really is shocking and unacceptable. There are two things we could do, three things. One, the influence of Saudi Arabia on our culture, which has been allowed to infiltrate at every level, including the schools Michael Gove set up, some of the Islamic schools. We need to do something about that. It's a distortion of the kind of Islam that's practiced in Saudi Arabia. Because of the oil, we suck up to them. And we must do something about the Saudi Arabian influence.
All right, Michael Gove.
I don't think there's any Saudi influence in any of the schools that we've set up in the last 5 years, and if there is evidence of that, Yasmin, do bring it to us. But I do think you make an important point. Not just in Saudi Arabia, but in some other countries in the Middle East, you have individuals who are responsible for funding the spread of an ideology that perverts Islam. Islam is a great religion. It brings spiritual nourishment to billions. But within Islam, there are a narrow group of individuals who take Islam and say that it should be a total system that should govern every aspect, not just of an individual's life, but how a state is run. That's what they mean by the idea of a caliphate. And there are individuals in Britain and across the globe who are looking for simplicity and certainty in their lives. And this twisted version of Islam gives them something in which to believe. I think that we've got to counter that by showing the same degree of passion and commitment to our values of freedom and tolerance and inclusion.
You should never have had religious schools. You promoted religious schools. That's created such huge problems in our society.
If you deny religious schools to Muslims, you have to deny them to Christians. And I think that there are...
But there's no evidence for Yasmin's point that religious schools in this country have generated extremists. Many of the extremists...
It's generated separatism, and it's created...
That is a separate point, Yasmin, but there's no evidence. I think it's important to stress it. None.
Not in Birmingham?
Not in Birmingham?
No, these weren't religious schools.
Michael.
I think
that was the whole point.
We worry about this in the wrong way. The numbers of British Muslims who go abroad to take part in these movements is tiny. And it's regrettable, and it's worrying, and it's terrible for their families, and there are going to be dangers when and if they return. But I think that we make too much of a fuss about it. What we have done as a country in recent years has not helped, and I think we should examine ourselves a little bit. I think that our launching with the United States of a war in Iraq, and I think our destruction of Libya, which is now a failed state thanks to our intervention, and I think what I believe to have been the West, I'm careful here what I say, the West's intervention in Syria, which destabilised the Assad government, leading to the enormous tragedy of destruction and refugees which that country now is, are blots on our past. And I think we should be very careful about lecturing other people about their militancy and their misbehaviour, not to forget our own very great failings in foreign policy, which are largely to blame for a lot of these problems.
And Andy Burnham. And if you can keep it brief.
Peter makes some fair points. I mean, it's too complicated, I think, to answer your question directly in the time that we've got. It's a huge question. But I think it does go back to the point that the gentleman made about a politics of intolerance and division that seems to be growing. Because I guess some young Muslim people kind of hear quite a lot coming out of the media that kind of denigrates them and sees them as second-class citizens, makes them feel that way and feel quite resentful that is how they're increasingly being portrayed. I'm not saying it's complicated. You asked me to kind of say why do they go. I'm just trying to give you a reason about why they feel in the way that they do. And we've got to understand that if we're going to deal with that. I think it is also linked though to the question we were just dealing with about too many young people in this country do not have enough hope for their own
No,
future.
no. We need to stop pointing the finger all the time at other people. I think Mr Hitchens' point's really good. We need to look at ourselves. These people came to school here, have lived within our society, and it's us, it's our responsibility to look after these people and to root out the causes of radicalisation.
All right.
Why are these people going abroad? That's what we need to do, not keep pointing the finger.
I'm not making excuses.
Which British society seems to have always done.
Danny Alexander.
Well, I have to say, I don't know. I don't know the answer to your question as to why it is that these people choose to do this. I wish that they wouldn't. I think it is an utterly abhorrent thing that they are choosing to do. I think in many cases, as Yasmin and Michael said, there is an abhorrent ideology which is kind of brainwashing people into making these choices. And I think that we do have a responsibility as a society and as a country to make sure that people understand why that is wrong, why it is the wrong choice to make, and why the British values that we were talking about earlier, about openness and tolerance, are a much better way to approach the problems of the world.
Now, we've only got a few minutes left, and I want to go back to the NHS, because we've had more questions on the NHS, and the question that's been put is one we've had over the past weeks from people, and it's a kind of, why is the NHS so politicised? Can I have the question from Rebecca Stout, who actually is a junior doctor? Rebecca.
If you're also committed to the health service, why not establish a multi-party select committee to plan and run it and stop it from being a political football?
Specifically to plan... So, to plan and run it objectively outside politics. Andy Burnham.
I think we were getting close to that consensus at the last general election. The NHS in 2010 had the lowest ever waiting list, the highest ever public satisfaction. Probably for that reason, David Cameron said there would be no top-down reorganisation. What happened was, within weeks of coming into government, he brought forward the biggest ever in the history of the NHS. And that reorganisation put the values of the market forces at the centre of the NHS. Now, that is...
Sorry,
I'm answering the question in my way, David, if you don't mind.
Please answer the question. Please answer the question that was asked. We know your views on the health service. It's not about your views. It's about why... Wait a moment. It's why, as a politician, you don't support... You say what the Tories did. If you win in the next election, would you be committed to a multi-party select committee to run it?
That reorganisation put the politics in. I believe the NHS will have the wrong values unless you repeal that bill and take those back out. That is the only way we will begin to recreate a consensus around the NHS. My point is, not a single person in this country gave Michael, Danny or David Cameron their permission to put the NHS up for sale in the way that they have. And until that is stopped, we will not be able to build a consensus that meets with the British public's values on the National Health Service.
So... We didn't get an answer. We did not get an answer to the question, why not establish a multi-party select committee? Would you do that?
I said...
To plan and run it. I mean... not you, but you with the Tories, with the Liberal Democrats, with...
Personally, £100 billion of public money always has to be accountable to Parliament, in my view. And there is a value judgment about what kind of NHS you want. I believe in an NHS based on collaboration over competition, integration over fragmentation, people before profits. If they can sign up to that, then we could sign up to a new consensus for the NHS.
Danny Alexander.
Well, I think there's a lot in what the lady says. Actually, part of what's happened in the NHS is that it is now run by a thing called the NHS Commissioning Board, which is at one step removed from ministers in the government. That board is comprised of experts in the National Health Service, whose job in England, of course, is a separate NHS in Scotland and in Wales, and in Northern Ireland, is precisely to try and do that. And at a local level, then, you have the local clinical commissioning groups, which involves local GPs, working sometimes with local authorities and so on, in making decisions in the National Health Service. So part of the idea there was precisely to do what you're suggesting. I think you can't take the politics completely out of the NHS, because, of course, people have different views about how it should work. I think that the main thing that we should be doing as a country and as a government is saying to the people who are running the National Health Service, the experts, we'll make sure that you have the funding you need to deliver the quality of public services, the quality of health services that people in this country expect. And that's what Nick Clegg was talking about in the debate this evening. Simon Stevens, who runs the NHS Commissioning Board, he has said that he thinks by the end of the next Parliament there'll need to be an extra £8 billion a year provided for the National Health Service. As of tonight, the Liberal Democrats are the only party that's committed by the end of the Parliament to finding that money. Of course, Andy and Michael this evening could alter that by saying that they would provide those resources and then allow the people who are actually in charge of the National Health Service to get on without the kind of scaremongering that you hear from Andy.
Yasmin, do you think it could be made turned away from being a political football?
Yes,
Clearly,
it is
a political football at the moment.
I think it's such a good question and something. The three politicians are still in their little lanes. They're thinking in terms of their own little lanes. We could think about the National Health Service as a National Health Service and leave the politics behind. And certainly the privatisation, which actually Labour began part of, the PFI and all of that, none of the people in this country want the privatisation, even the partial privatisation of the National Health Service. Get together, do what the people want. I think it's such a good idea. Well done.
Let me hear from the woman at the very back there. Yes.
Politicians are quick to talk about the NHS in terms of numbers, but no one's actually told us what that means in real terms, what it means for people.
Peter Hitchens.
If I could just answer the doctor's question, it won't happen because the NHS is the only thing in the country which Labour hasn't actually ruined. And therefore they cling to it like a lifebelt. They wreck the schools by destroying the grammar schools. They've repeatedly wrecked the economy. Their nationalisation programme turned out to be a disaster. There is almost nothing they can really lay claim for except the NHS, and therefore they have to absolutely cling hold of it. And what we had over the past 10 years is a wrestling match between Labour and the Tories, because the Tories are trying to wrestle the NHS off them and say, no, it wasn't you, it was us. We're the ones who are going to spend more and more money on it. In the middle of this, you won't need me to tell you how many problems there are with it that don't get solved. It's a good idea, but alas, as long as the Labour Party exists, it's politically impossible.
It's still the best. It was voted the best system in the world, bar none. So be proud of our National Health Service.
It's quite good, but it's not that
good. Be proud. Don't run it down.
I think instead of point scoring and doing little things against each other, why don't you just swallow your ego and become a bit more proactive as politicians and start making plans?
But there's something we disagree about, and we disagree with competition in the NHS.
Michael
and
Gove,
we can't agree until they remove it.
Michael Gove.
I think the basic idea is a good one. I'm not sure whether or not it should be a select committee or precisely how you do it, but one thing I would say is that, to be fair to Danny's party, Norman Lamb, one of the most impressive MPs in the Liberal Democrats, has worked with Jeremy Hunt in order to try to improve the NHS. And one of the people whom they've been working with, the guy that Danny mentioned, Simon Stevens, used to be a Labour appointee. So you've got three people from three different parties working together.
Jeremy Hunt's background is of English and then business. And I'm sorry, but Andy, your background is an English degree as well. So why have we got people that have no background of ever having worked in health making these policies?
I think to be...
It doesn't make sense.
To be fair, politicians from a wide variety of backgrounds have to be held accountable for these decisions. But as Danny pointed out, I think entirely fairly, some of the changes that have occurred within the NHS over the last few years have been designed to give GPs and clinical directors in our hospitals more control over what happens. But your basic point, I think, is right. The NHS should be an area where politicians from different parties can work together, and over the last 5 years, people from different political traditions absolutely have. But there's one other thing I would say as well, which is that if we're going to continue to invest in the NHS, we need to have a strong economy. And I think it's important, too, that we back the difficult decisions that have been made in order to ensure that we've got the funding for high-quality care.
We've got to stop. Our time's up, I'm sorry. Thank you very much indeed. We're in Bristol next week. And among those on the Question Time panel, Vince Cable for the Liberal Democrats, Douglas Alexander will be here for Labour, Caroline Lucas for the Greens. And the following week we're going to be in East London. So if you'd like to come either to Bristol or to East London, apply by going to our website or call us on 0330 123 9988. If you've been listening on BBC Radio 5 Live, the debate continues on Question Time Extra Time. But for here, my thanks to our panel, to all of you who sat through the 2-hour debate and then commented on it afterwards, here in Salford. From Question Time, good night.
More reaction to the leaders' debate to come on This Week next.
BBC Radio 5 Live is where news comes to life.
Every weekday morning on 5 Live Breakfast, we discuss the stories that matter to you.
With your comments and expert opinion, we bring a unique view to